One of my favorite quotes from the movie The Airplane is, "First, the Earth cooled, then the dinosaurs came. But that's not important right now." And so we have this tendency or this possibility of thinking that history isn't something that we really care that much about. And so if you don't remember the Woolworth stores, they were popular in the earlier years of the 20th century and throughout the late 20th century, but they are no more, at least in the United States and in most places of the world. And so our goal here is to just show you, how did we get to this information problem that we've got now? All right, so here's a rough timeline of the way that we did information. And so we start with scribes and, before 0 AD, and then you've got Gutenberg and the printing press, which everybody remembers, and typewriters and so on and so forth. So let's walk through each of these real quickly to talk about what its impact is on information. We start with scribes, and back in the pre-AD days, so in the BC days, we had few scribes, very learned, and that's all they could do. It was their skill, it was their job to be able to write. And the problem was transcription errors were very common. Texts were difficult to acquire, i.e. you had to have a lot of money before you could get anything. And the Egyptian Book of the Dead, the length of your book was how wealthy you were, because it was how much you had to pay a scribe to write the hieroglyphics. And we lived pretty much in this world where scribes were manually copying things until around 1450. In 1450, Gutenberg invented the movable type printing press, and he also did a whole bunch of other innovations that surround it, but he is responsible for the movable type printing press. And what that meant was we could suddenly make mass production of works possible. We've heard about his Bible, the Gutenberg Bible, and how it was made so that more and more people could get it. It was less expensive. You may or may not know that Gutenberg didn't actually get the profit from selling the Bible. He was a great inventor, but a lousy businessman. So one of the other things that the Gutenberg printing press created for us was a reduction or an elimination of transcription errors, because once it made it on the press, you were going to get the same thing over and over and over and over again. Now, it's about this time that we changed what it meant to be literate. It used to be that literacy was the ability to read and write your own name. That's all it used to be. But it started to shift with Gutenberg, and we started to drive literacy as the ability to read. Things were relatively quiet until about 1870, when the typewriter was invented. Now you're like, hey, wait a minute, this is a typewriter, and what does this have to do with today? Well, the most interesting thing about the typewriter is it is the foundation for the keyboard, for the computer. It laid the way for us to reliably reproduce text. You say, wait a minute, it gave us some standardization to this process of typing. It drove consistency, and it also generated the ability for people to create more works, because if you could type it, it became easier to replicate it. It became quicker to type than it is to write in some cases. In fact, early typewriters were designed to minimize typing speed. That's this QWERTY thing that we've got going on. That's really designed to slow us down, because the hammers would swing up and hit each other and create a problem. So most of the time, the secretaries before the typewriter were men. They were people who were writing things down, and they were the business learned. And what happened is when women entered the workforce, they learned the typewriter and became very, very valuable. With the typewriter, we can now create the same text over again. Now, we've got to type it over again, but it looks very, very similar. Now we get to the copy machine. And this is 1959. I'm rounding this to 1960. And the Xerox Corporation created the xenographic copy process. So what is that, xenographic? The short of it is it's like original. We used to have these mimeograph things that were alcohol and chemicals that you could get high on in grade school for me. But now we have the ability to get like new originals, or like new copies. They look almost like the original with relatively few errors. Now, this is an analog day, and so you do have copy of copy kinds of issues. But it really paved the way for the laser printers we use today in computers. It is the evolution of being able to create and recreate content at any level. Now we don't have to type it over again to get another copy of it. We can actually just throw it on the copy machine, hit copy, and boom, we can have 1 or 100 more copies. Starting about 1970, we started to get computers that were as big as houses, but they were generating content. They were starting to make electronic content of their own. No longer did you have people making registers. You had computers keeping track of how much energy you used and what your bill was, and banks were starting to use them for all sorts of things to manage your accounts. And we started to see where the typewriters were converted into computer-driven printers. So we take the second half, the back half of a typewriter, and effectively we said, well, rather than a person typing that stuff out, we'll have a computer type it out. And then printers evolved, and they used a lot of typewriter kinds of technologies in the start, but we started to see this momentum, right? Because now we're in the 1960s to the 70s, 1 decade apart. We're seeing some real powerful ways that information is changing. We're starting to generate content by a computer. And if you get into the 1980s, that's the land of the Commodore 64 and the Apple IIe, and we hit mass consumption. We hit the point at which the computers were no longer so expensive that nobody could buy them, but rather everybody had to have them. They were seen as the thing for people to have. Now, any home can generate their own content. With a computer and a printer, you can now replace, in most cases, a typewriter. All of a sudden, people start saving electronic copies of their correspondence. You may not remember, but there was a whole industry around floppy disks and floppy disk storage, right? So we moved all of this stuff, and then we had to figure out how to store it. This is the first time that a lot of errors started to disappear. So if you were typing something, you made a mistake, you could back up, you could hit correction, a little whiteout, again, something you could sniff that get high. But this was the first time that things started to look perfect because you did your correction before you committed them to paper. Slowly, any typing classes that existed in schools became keyboarding classes. We knew that the big thing was no longer going to be the typewriter, it's going to be the computer because everyone could have one. Then what? Well, what happened next was we started networking all these computers. We have tons and tons of computers. And around the 1990s, and again, by the way, we're on a 1 decade pace here. We used to be 1,450 years before innovation, and then another 200 for the typewriter. Now we're decade by decade. And computer networks developed, and we're starting to get larger hard drive capacities. By the way, 20 meg. Oh, having a hard drive, 20 meg or 30. Ooh, that was hot stuff, right? But it's getting larger and larger. We're moving from small floppy disks to more and more storage. We started to move to shared storage. So we'd buy one big hard drive, and everybody would share it. It started to become easier to store electronic copies than paper copies. So instead of saving a copy of the correspondence and sliding it in a file for a customer, we started to save them in a folder on the network instead. Now, one of my favorite stories is when I was running a network, and it was a Novell MHS-based system, message handling system. It was a store and forward email, not terribly unlike what we have today, except that there were long delays. Suddenly, we started communicating with folks in the Ukraine via email. We didn't do our paper-based communication anymore. All of our communications to China and all the places overseas that we were sourcing materials, we stopped doing them on faxes and started moving them to electronic. And that was because of the power of networks. And that in those days it was CompuServe. But we started to see the emergence of computer networks and their impact. Next up, in the 2000s, we started seeing digital photography, which is really real digital photography. There were some older technologies, but we just really didn't get there until about 2000. And we saw a huge spike in the amount of storage we needed, because a page of text, 50K. It's about 50 kilobytes of storage. But a good, solid image is around 5 megabytes of storage. So a huge jump in the amount of storage, and a whole new class of systems to manage this media. They have now digital asset management systems, DAM. And those systems started to be able to categorize digital photography. Are there people in it? Is it a landscape? Is it bright? Is it dark? Is it whatever it is? You had to be able to start to tag things onto your digital photography where you didn't have that need so much with letters. It used to be that wedding photographers hated digital. In fact, they're shooting on medium format, large format, so that they could get big prints. Now almost nobody, shoots on film anymore for photography. Most people are shooting digital, and that's because we've made this transition to our information being almost entirely digital. Now, around about 2010, we started to see that video became more mainstream. Yeah, YouTube had been around for a couple of years, but we started to see that video was the new medium of choice. And in doing this, we saw our storage needs increase again. If you think about what is a 2-hour DVD movie, that's about 4.7 gigabytes of storage. So we suddenly have moved from the round of kilobytes to megabytes to now we're into gigabytes. It also created this other problem that we hadn't seen before, which is a video is one stream of content which has lots and lots of blocks in it, lots of words said, lots of places that somebody might want to index into. And so that created a new problem for our systems that we've still not really coped that well with, of time indexing content. So we've moved our unstructured content through these years, but what about our structured content? Well, structured content or databases, relational databases, have turned out to be the thing that has really come to be. We used to have these ISAM databases and hierarchical databases and on and on and on. But in 1970 and 71, Edgar Codd standardized normalization of relational databases. So now we've got a framework for structuring databases. The problem with this idea that Codd really did a great job, and he did, is that only about 20% of the information that we process is what we would call structured. That is, it fits in neat little rows and columns. You can connect the dots, and it's rows and columns, and that's what it is. This video that you're watching, this presentation that was used to create it, all unstructured content. So what is unstructured data? Well, that's the stuff that information architecture is built on. It's built on the stuff that doesn't fit in the neat little rows and columns. It's everything else. It's the kitchen junk drawer of content. 80%, and we'll see this again, 80% of what we learn, we get from undirected passive experiences. In other words, we get 80% of what we know from the randomness of our everyday life. And because of that, we have a problem in terms of trying to organize the randomness to the point that we can get meaning out of it.